Hello, and welcome to the podcast Invisible Wound. This podcast is a limited series of 6 episodes, which is part of a larger project called Hakara, Facing Transgenerational Trauma. This project was initiated by AMCHA. AMCHA is an organization that was established in 1987 by a group of Holocaust survivors and devoted mental health professionals. My name is Sharon Ryba-Kahn. I'm a Berlin-based filmmaker and a third generation of survivors of the Shoah. This is the perspective I'll be speaking from. For this podcast, we will be traveling to what is known to be the world's oldest continent, and which we know as Australia. The Aboriginal people of Australia are the custodians of the world's oldest living culture, a culture that is 60,000 years old. In order for me to avoid any types of cultural appropriation, I ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and for them to share where they are from and how they perceive trauma, and also how fighting trauma is present in their work and in their lives. Welcome, Tiriki. Welcome, Alec. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Shall I go first?
You go first.
My name's Bill Onus. I'm a Yorta Yorta and Jar Jawarang artist, academic, and now filmmaker. Living here on the lands of the Kulin Nation, on Bunurong and Wurundjeri country, to be specific. I've lived here for the majority of my life. However, it is the love and diplomacy shown to me by traditional owners and elders who speak for and to this place that have allowed me and my family to flourish in this space and to tell the stories very much embodied within Ablaze.
I'm Alec Morgan, long-time filmmaker, and now have been an academic, and basically for a long time, I've been making documentaries mostly in the industry since the 1970s.
And you're also both in different places. You are somewhere else, right, Alec?
Yes. Well, I'm up north, Darug country, known as Sydney, and
incorrectly known
Melbourne.
as Sydney. Yes.
Incorrectly known as Sydney.
Incorrectly known as Sydney, Darug country, and down in incorrectly known as Melbourne, which we call Narm down here.
Excellent. So we're right in it.
And I'm a Gabbar.
Gabbar, a very specific technical term for non-Indigenous person, which
White
person, which is found its way into the vernacular for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly here in the southeast of the continent.
Perfect. And you two made an incredible film together called Ablaze, which came out in 2021 and which had its world premiere at the Melbourne International Film Festival. It starts in a very, very particular way, which is actually quite a transgenerational way, which is the first image is really of you, Tiriki, holding your baby daughter, I think it is, right? And wrapping her in a possum skin cloak. Would you tell me a bit about that scene, what a possum skin cloak is, and both of you also then the meaning of that scene, and why is this film opening just like that?
I'll go back, if I may, a little bit earlier than the birth of my first daughter, Ninda. It would have been about more than 30 years ago, that I sat with my father on the side of the road, skinning possums that we'd found during our travels that day, possums that had been killed by cars and trucks travelling up and down the Sturt Highway, roadkill. We would collect possums and birds and other animals that had met their fate in unceremonious fashion on the roads and then use them to make art. And as we'd sit there plucking these birds or very occasionally skinning a possum, he would tell me these stories of the significance of these animals, that these animals came from country, the same country that we come from, that they embodied our story and our knowledge, our law, L-A-W and L-O-R-E, and that there was magic in them, that same magic and stories that belonged to each of us. And as we scan these possums, you tell me about how, for us in the southeast of Australia, there was no more significant and tangible piece of cultural identity than, as we say in our Yorta Yorta language, the biganga, or the possum skin cloak. That we were presented with our biganga at birth, the inside of which would be incised with stories of country and belonging, stories that we were to be custodian and responsible for. And as we grow, so too does our cloak grow with us, that we add more pelts to that, we incise more stories on that. When it comes time for ceremony, we turn it inside out and we wear it through that ceremony ground so everyone can see us as women and men of degree and stature for the knowledge and the history and the responsibility that we literally carry on our backs. And then one day when we die, it becomes our funeral shroud. We're wrapped in it, we're buried, and it passes with us all the way through this life and into the next. But he also told me that the making of our cloaks had for a long time been illegal, that it was still illegal for us to hunt the possums, to collect the materials, which is why we were collecting roadkill at the side of the road to make our artwork, our stories. He told me about how his father, Bill, had told him these stories too, and he promised me that one day we would make our biganga, our cloaks again. We never managed to collect the required 60 or 70 possums that it would take to make an entire cloak, but that story stayed with me. And when I was expecting the birth of my first daughter, Ninda, it came back to me again. I'd found pictures of my great-great-great-great-grandparents in their cloaks. And I thought about the significance of Ninda, my daughter, being the first in our family in 6 or 7 generations to be born with her biganga, with this story that I knew that Bill, who was so much the subject of this film, had kept alive, that he'd passed to my father and my father then to me. It seemed incredibly fitting that his stories and the stories of our family should populate the surface of that biganga, of that cloak, and that she, like all of her grandmothers and grandfathers for thousands of generations before her, should be wrapped in that cloak again. And it was a deeply poignant and powerful moment that we probably don't fully explore to the greatest extent in the film because there's so much story to tell, but there's so much weight to that. For me, I never at the time expected that we would be putting this into a film. This was really my partner, Amanda, me and Ninda alone in a hospital room as I wrapped her in that biganga. But thankfully Amanda's camera skills were such that it fit in wonderfully. It made its way into the film. In fact, we probably should have given her a camera credit, Alec. But there you go. She got a special thanks. But it's wonderful. It's very much a Bill story for me, the story of the cloak, because had he not held on to that knowledge, had he not, in the face of tremendous adversity, maintained even just the story of the biganga and its importance for us in our family, for me, this was closing a loop within our own family. This passion that I knew for at least 3 generations had burned from Bill to Lynn, my father, and then to me, to finally bring that close and to make a cloak for Ninda, and now to have subsequently made cloaks for my other 2 daughters, Yelene and Lakara, as well, has been really something rather special and powerful. And I think most wonderful in all of that to me is that it's completely normal to them.
Alec, I still want to go back to the film. There's a choice in there, as it is the opening scene of the film. Tell me about that.
I mean, it threads its way through the film. So it's the motif that threads its way through the film, which runs parallel to the telling of Bill's stories. So structurally, it comes into the film at certain points where Tiriki decides to make a possum skin cloak for Bill, his grandfather, and then wears it when he sings at the end. And, you know, so structurally it's paralleling what Bill was doing by reviving his culture in 1946. So it's about something that's also contemporary here, particularly in Victoria, where the possum skin cloak is significant. Has been a revival of that particular form of culture, which Tiriki has also been heavily involved in too. So, and it was the fact that the first skin that Tiriki carved, as you see him carving in that opening scene, is for his daughter, but it's his memories of Bill, in a sense, in an artistic way.
So it's Bill's panel, yeah.
And so it was Bill's panel, so it links to our introduction to Bill, so it allows us to introduce Bill. So that's how it has that link in the narrative structure.
So what is the film about, and who is the film about?
Well, it's about Bill Onus. Yeah.
Who is?
It's a biography of Tiriki knows a lot about Bill. He's brought up with it, but and in Victoria, Bill Onus was one of the incredible group, a small group in Victoria, who came out of Kamaragundja Mission, which was on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, and they all sort of left. Bill had left earlier, but he was an organizer of the first Indigenous strike in 1939 when they all walked off, which was the first time Aboriginal people had organised to do a walk-off, a protest, and they crossed over to Victoria, and many of them went to Melbourne, as we follow this in the film. But some of the other activists had got known publicly, like Sir Doug Nicholls, and Bill, who was more radical in his politics. First of all, he revived culture, and he was talking about the importance of culture, which that's why the possum skin cloak is in there. And in Australia, what's happening probably in the last decade, would you say, Tiriki, it's growing stronger and stronger in different parts in the last 15 years or so, is things like language revival. As the possum skin cloak is Victoria specific, that's been revived in beautiful ways too. And other areas, Central Australia was the painting revival, because white colonisation of Australia really hammered Indigenous Aboriginal culture. I mean, really, and language, and really, I mean, brutally. The history of Australia is brutal.
So how is the revival of Aboriginal culture impacting Australian society?
I think for a long time, non-Aboriginal people within Australia have been told that the stories of this place are not for them. That they have been told that you can't engage in conversation, you can't celebrate the history of tens of thousands of years, 65, 80, however many thousands of years we want to. It's a bigger number than we can truly comprehend. Thousands upon thousands of generations, and yet we are fed this falsehood that Australia somehow started in the late 18th century. Whereas the history of this country is all around us. It is woven through the fabric of our very identities, even those of us who don't know it. Everyone in Australia, I would wager, speaks words in Aboriginal languages every day that they don't know truly are there. They don't know where they come from, whether it be the name of a suburb of the towns or cities that they live in, whether it be the name of a street, whether it be words that have found their ways into the Australian vernacular, that that culture is all around us. However, it only has existed through the incredible dedication of those who have sought to keep it alive. That it is still illegal for me to go out now and hunt possums to make clothes with. I have to buy the majority of my possum skins from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the possum was a pest and was introduced as part of the fur trade in the 1850s.
Still is a pest.
Still is a pest, I beg your pardon. It is still a pest. I'm doing my best to reduce the possum numbers in Aotearoa. But at the same time, I still can't do that. But in my grandfather's time, it was still, in many places, largely illegal to speak your language, to engage in dance or song or ritual or ceremony, to make art. And it is at the time when Bill's working that he and his contemporaries managed to subvert the relationship that broader mainstream Australia has with Aboriginal art and artists. They start commercialising the work they're producing. They start finding a market and people who want to have this in the front rooms of their houses. They start finding a way to be present in Australian society. Whereas at the same time, for Aboriginal people who are living on government mission stations, often run by various churches, you're not allowed to leave. If in some states you want to get off the mission, you can sometimes apply for what they used to call dog tags, which was a certificate of exemption where you could formally rescind your Aboriginality, but you weren't allowed to fraternise with your family, speak your language, engage in dance. You still couldn't access certain services. And this was going through right the way up into the 1960s. So at the time when Bill's working, this notion of engaging in what is largely an illegal act, but doing it publicly, hiding in plain sight to be able to put ceremony and performance on a stage in front of an audience and call it a performance rather than calling it ceremony, maintaining cultural practice, is huge. It shows, I think, incredible innovation and insight on the parts of Bill and all those around him who were doing this work at the time, that they're so staunchly opposed to having their identity lost that they refuse to assimilate, that they want the rights of a citizen. They want the same rights as other people, but are not willing to give anything up of our identities in order to have that. That makes this story all the more powerful. It is very much about Bill, certainly Ablaze, but it is also about the extraordinary women and men around him who are doing this work as well, and each of them finding different voices and different ways in which to do it. Bill chose to be a radical, and I love that about him, and I certainly feel that I have something of the radical in myself, that he was uncompromising, and I have tremendous love and respect for that. But that didn't work on its own. It had to work in consort with his co-collaborators and co-conspirators who were willing to fulfill other roles in the conversation as well, to be the conciliators, to be the peacemakers, but then to still have their message brought through. That good cop, bad cop, if you will, of intercultural relations in Australia in the mid-20th century is extraordinary to behold.
Was Ablaze an opportunity to be close to your grandfather?
Yes.
Or closer? Because you didn't meet him.
I didn't meet him, but he's always lived so large in the mythologies of our family. I think every family has mythologies. There'll be stories of those family members that went before that we'll never meet, but it was a real opportunity. It was very emotional, and I've always felt really close to Bill. But through this process, I think I've felt a lot closer. I've found myself repeatedly through the course of my life asking myself questions like, well, what would Bill have done? And then later on, what would my father have done? Because my father died quite young as well. But this was an opportunity to be close to Bill. I feel like I know him in a different way now.
So, in a way, Ablaze is a continuation of Bill's work.
Bill was very passionate about bringing his story to the world. and the opportunity to bring this story to not just his story, but the story of those around him and the story of the struggle. The other thing I think that's very important for me about this film is that it's still, whilst it centres on Bill, it's still very much a story of allyship. And an allyship not just between Bill and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists of the day, but an allyship between Bill and his contemporaries and mainstream white Australian people who couldn't handle the world being the way that it was, who desperately wanted to affect change, who wanted to come together. And I think that's still part of the story that we miss sometimes. It was really important for me to co-direct this film with Alec, because I think I hope in our collaboration together, we have a pretty good simpatico. I mean, it took us 6 years to make the film, and we're both still alive. We haven't really had any major arguments in all of that time. There's something very powerful in that story, but it comes with a question of where the authority of voice sits. And I think for a lot of the work that Bill did and a lot of those who he collaborated with, they were very passionate about seeing Aboriginal people not being spoken for, not speaking on behalf of Aboriginal people, but rather amplifying the voice of Aboriginal Australia and then being able to take it to the world and the arts in general, whether it was fine arts or souvenir production or performing arts, were quintessential to that. The way that other people made space, and not just made space, but amplified the voice of Aboriginal activists, is a big part of Australian history that we also don't tell. For all of my non-Indigenous family and friends and the students that I work with and the colleagues that I work with every day, they're not necessarily given the great examples of those who have gone before them, people from their own cultural background as non-Aboriginal people, to be proud of either. They don't see a space. As I said before, for so long, we in Australia have been told there is Aboriginal Australia all the way over one side, there is non-Aboriginal Australia on the other, and the two very rarely meet or intermingle. And if there is that opportunity, there's always a deficit. There's not a strength. We don't talk about celebrating together. It's always about what's been lost or what people can't say, not about what people can say. And I hope this film will do some of that. And that's why we tried to make it accessible, to be able to take it to the world, because there is so much history that hasn't been told here in Australia that you kind of have to start from the beginning anyway.
Alec, you said earlier you have been working on films since the 70s. How has that been for you as a filmmaker, and which fights did you have to fight?
You know, Australia is, I can't kind of phrase it really. All I know is this film and other films that are now seen as important that I worked on took a hell of a lot of work to get out there. You know, there's, you know, Australia is great at forgetting. Australians are really good at forgetting. And I, you know, take the responsibility to say that as, these films were not easy to make. I wish they were. I don't like spending a lot of time, having to try and raise the funds. I don't like spending a lot of time having to go, with no money to try and finish a film that's seen as important. I mean, it is about memory and forgetting to me. I mean, on one hand, you have the importance of Indigenous memory, and you have what you can see as an active culture rehealing itself and revitalizing itself. The other culture that exists in Australia, I think the reason why a lot of, Gabbars like me forget is because, Australia's a wealthy country.
Mm.
And we must never forget that to me, at the heart of it, although we live in the city and, it's a nice suburb I live in, but most of those incarcerated in Australia, the great majority are Indigenous. The great, if there was a value put on Indigenous Australia, we could deal with whatever problems are going in Australia because this is a very, very wealthy country. Instead, we have mining companies still destroying sacred sites of the oldest living culture on earth, and they don't even get a rap over the knuckles for it. This is the truth about Australia behind all the bullshit. It is self-indulgent, it's wealthy, and it could deal with these things if it truly wanted to. And as a white person, I've had to live with that for my life, of seeing and witnessing the racism that underlines the lack of ability to do something about the fact that you have massive suicide, you have massive incarceration, and so that's why my role was only to educate. So we're not just making films here; we're making a political statement about a man whose values were about something bigger than just exploiting the countryside.
So you both know that the title of the podcast is Invisible Wound. What do you think about when you hear the title?
But I mean, the first thing it comes back to was the film I made on the stolen generations. And I actually got an email from Pauline Craigie about the women, Kamaraganja women who were taken away, part of the stolen generation, and how some of them have found it very difficult to talk about that. Those kind of traumas that, the people today still in Australia who are dealing with that trauma of being taken away from their families. She was doing a project with these women who were taken away to a place called Cootamundra Girls' Home. And it always sticks with me if I just could make a statement that, because often I don't talk about these things because it's something you live with in Australia. But I often wonder, the film I made was made out of hearing, a couple of women up in a place called Dodge City, Brewarrina, where Essie Coffey lived, which is probably the poorest Aboriginal suburb in New South Wales. And I was interviewing in the 1970s before we made My Survival as an Aboriginal, and these women, elderly women, talking about being taken away and how they found it hard to talk about it. And the sorrow and the pain came across immediately, which triggered for me, a desire to know more about the sorrow and this pain that you sensed in this community. And it's often, but you couldn't find anything written about it. You couldn't find anything where the subject the word didn't exist. No one, it took years to get that film made because you were talking to people, white people, about making this film, about taking kids away, and they'd shrug their shoulders and they'd know nothing about it. I mean, what I'm trying to get through here is the silence that exists in Australia. It's a horrible British kind of silence. You don't speak about the wounds. You don't speak about the traumas. It's British. It's a very British way of dealing with things, is you deny it, you hide it.
So we've mentioned those two very important films you've worked on, My Survival as an Aboriginal by Essie Coffey and Lousy Little Sixpence. Could you share a little bit more about them?
I think it is I can't quite put my finger. I mean, you know, it's huge. It was huge chunks of time to make those films, but essentially we were making them with the future in mind. Particularly, Essie wanted to get across the idea of, not only to her own children and to Aboriginal people, but to white people as well. And it was at a time, even in the 70s, when, for instance, school teachers asked me to take them down to see the Aboriginal community because there was a big, rift between education and Aboriginal people who didn't want to be involved with it because of the past. The other reason for making them is that when you grow up without a history and you're told your history comes from Britain, you want to know the history of the land you're living on. I felt, discovering the story, for instance, of Lousy Little Sixpence of the Stolen Generation, that I had uncovered this I thought it was the most important story that Australia had to know. So it was my second film. I'd only made a short film and worked on Essie's film, and I just stumbled my way through it. But I remember that it was something that if the country was going to kind of heal itself, it had to confront these terribly traumatic events that happened in the past. And at that time, the only events that were known publicly were the 19th century massacres. And here was something that was going on in the 20th century. And if you looked at education in those days, there was virtually nothing on the 20th century, particularly towards Indigenous Australians or any of these events.
Could you summarize in 2 sentences what the 2 films are about so that,
Well, My Survival as an Aboriginal is Essie Coffey, who's a Murrawari woman, who's sort of a matriarch of a community who wanted to tell her story and how she survived the white kind of policies and how she was educating her children into Indigenous culture. And that's fundamentally what the film's about. Lousy Little Sixpence was the first film that broke the story of what's known as the Stolen Generation, where there was a policy to remove young Aboriginal boys and girls from their families and take them away and often put them out, the girls as domestic servants or servants on stations, cattle stations. And the boys were sent to work as labourers on cattle stations often as well. But often there was a lot of trauma involved in the removal, forcibly removed by police and by law. So it was about survivors, actual survivors of that, of an earlier generation who became activists, some of them, talking about that event in their lives.
Tiriki, is feeling unseen or feeling invisible something you can relate to or identify with?
Hugely. For my entire life, I think there has been this challenge of not only navigating unseen trauma, but discovering new trauma all the time through this process as well. And I think, and that's part of this process that no one really prepares you for, I think, especially even in something like making this film about Bill. But in all of the work that I do is that as we go on, I'm very fortunate that I came from a family that is incredibly passionate about education, and my father was very passionate. He was thrown out of school when he was 15 years old because he was the only Aboriginal kid in the school, and they wanted to get rid of him, and so they found excuses to throw him out.
And you suffered racism too at school.
Oh, all the time. I still do, constantly, even now. That doesn't go away. I mean, I was particularly in my childhood. it was terrible. I mean, it was physical. It was violent. I was used to being beaten up constantly. Thankfully, I grew a lot and got bigger and hairier and scarier over time. But it was difficult. When my father was thrown out of school, one of the first things that his father, Bill, did was to speak to a friend of his, Jimmy Sharmans, who used to run these boxing troops, and they were there would be country fairs and things all over the place that these boxing troops would travel around to, and people would get up and spar, and he wanted Lynn to go and learn how to box so that he was at least physically capable of looking after himself, because he knew how hard life was going to be out there. And indeed, this was something that my father was very keen that I, as a child, not that I would ever be violent, but that at least I was able to deflect that physical violence, because he knew it was coming. So yes, I absolutely experienced it a lot as a child, and not just from people my own age, from adults and people around me, in a school system that didn't that certainly didn't care or want to hear. I was punished in school at about the age of 6 or 7, I think. I think I was 7. I was punished for daring to say that my grandfather Bill had started the Moomba Festival, which we talk about in the film Ablaze, which is a big deal here in Melbourne, in Australia. How dare I lie to the teacher? And off I was sent to the headmaster's office, or headmistress's office, I should say, to be punished, because I dared to lie. Because how could my grandfather ever have done that? But in this process of navigating, and I'm very passionate about reclaiming. I'm passionate about reclaiming my language and history and techniques. That's why the cloak is so important. The big angle is so important to me. There's something powerful about doing something that your grandmothers and grandfathers have done for thousands of generations with your hands, doing that same thing and knowing how tenuous it was for a time there when it was almost lost. But as one engages more, as you research more, as you come to find more of these stories, I'm re-traumatized again, because every time I learn something new, I have to come to terms with why I didn't know that and why that was taken away. And that, it just on a very immediate level, happens almost on a daily basis. Of course, my own family history is replete with stories of struggle, of family members that have lost their lives through the struggle again and again and again. And sometimes those stories and those histories can be more disturbing when one realizes how desensitized you have become to it. When you start to accept things as part of a history and part of a way of being. And it happens to me all the time when I realize something which would potentially be quite shocking to someone else because of that experience that one has had growing up, seeing family members who have died in police custody, or the history of family members who have been stolen away, or just the persecution that one gets for being Aboriginal, and coming from a mixed race family, for either being too dark or not being dark enough, and some strange eugenics blood quantum that gets applied to one to try to categorise you and work out how Aboriginal you are, is an extraordinary world to live through. And it's disturbing to me when I realise how much of that I've accepted. Not that I've accepted it willingly, but how much I just, that's how it was. And so there is so much of this that is unseen. And there's so much that I carry, but at the same time, there's so much there that I draw strength from as well. When I see that which we have lived through. And I've reached a point in my life now, I think, where I've started saying, well, no, I'm not talking. I'm not talking in the deficit necessary to other people who want to ask these questions of me, because I want to talk about the strengths. I want to talk about the strengths because I don't want my 3 girls growing up in a world where they either take these histories for granted or where they don't see the value in maintaining them. I want them to be able to see that struggle, but I want them to be able to see that struggle from a position of strength. The extraordinary women and men that have gone there before and have fought so that they can have that, so that it can be normal for them. That, I think, is what gets me through it as well. That navigating this trauma can be paralysing and debilitating. But at the same time, if we can free ourselves enough to step outside the mindset, quite often, of those who traumatised us in the first place, because I think we often inherit that framework for how we engage with our own histories. We engage from a place of deficit. If we can move outside of the language that those who hurt us in the first place were using, we start to see the strengths in our families. And I see it in the marginalised and downtrodden peoples all over the world, and the sense of strength that I get connecting with other First Nations peoples, whether it be in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Canada, or an extraordinary group of Sami artists that I met working on a project years ago. I'm seeing people who are maintaining culture and practice, to see the way fundamentally as human beings we can move through that, and we still hold on to that which is important, so that we can start talking about what it's like X number of generations on from a moment, but understanding that those moments are a structure. They're not an event. They're not something that happened and are done. Rather, we live with the structure of invasion, of segregation, of racism and anti-Semitism are, I think, so deeply ingrained in the structures of our societies that very rarely are we given the opportunity to step outside and see them for what they are. That whether it was invasion of Australia, whether it was the Holocaust, these weren't things that happened and then stopped happening. These were products of a society and a framework which we still live in now. And now I'm getting on my soapbox, Alec.
You tell the story of your grandfather, Bill Onus, in Ablaze. Could one say then that this film is a way of continuing Aboriginal culture? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And, well, I think it makes sense. Ablaze to me is an oral history. And all the work that I try to do in many things is about how we can maintain systems of knowledge that have lasted a heck of a lot longer than what the written word actually has. That I think when we put knowledge into a whole lot of people, then it becomes more infallible than what we write down on a piece of paper, which can be changed and edited and lost. When we hold knowledge ourselves, there's something very powerful about that. And I think that it's not just true of Aboriginal knowledge systems here in Australia. I think it's true of people the world over, that oftentimes there are many cultures which recognise that strength. Ablaze for me sits in that space. There's something very powerful about being able to tell a story. Even for me, that moment of my father telling me the significance of our bigang and of our possumsy and cloaks growing up was about a lived experience. It was about it's the stories that we remember, right? It's not necessarily it's the facts and figures, and it's the stories. Yes, I mean, I still remember from being taught in school that it was Henry Waterhouse and William Kent that brought the merino sheep to Australia. That was the type of history that you got taught. But much more than that, I remember the stories of the people. And so to be able to contribute, for me to be able to narrate a film like that, to put my voice to it, to to tell those stories, I think, was vitally important. As a kid, there was not a question that I ever asked my father that was not answered with a story. That was just how it went. You know, you didn't get a simple yes or no. It was like, sit down. Oh, God, here we go. You know, no matter what it was. But it's beautiful. And I think that it speaks to all of us. Film especially, speaks to us all, because there is that fundamental notion of storytelling. There is interaction with it. We can have so much more of a relationship with it because it's dynamic and it's speaking to us. I really, really love that about this process. And the best part is you can go back, and if you don't like that edit, you can do it again and you can have another take, and it's fantastic until you get just the right inflection that you want. As Alec knows, because he forces me to do so many takes of everything we record.
So it's a continuation. I mean, did I understand you right? You would say that filmmaking could be seen as a continuation of oral history?
For me, it is. For me, it's absolutely is. I mean, I think it's a question of the resources and technologies available to people at the time. And I'm sure, you know, if film was around 3,000 generations ago, when my grandmothers and grandfathers were telling these stories, they would have committed it to film then. Instead, they committed those stories to the surface of a possum skin cloak, or they committed them to a song. They entrusted them to children. They put them into artwork and landscape and the world around them. That film is another tool like that fits this mold for me very, very well. And for me, I see it as being one and the same. It's about the intent that we bring to it, certainly, but I feel that same energy in engaging with the story, and when I connect with a person, it's that same thing. So for me, the medium is somewhat newer, but the song remains the same at the very heart.
And you are an opera singer, so
I did that for a bit. Yeah.
You did that, okay? Okay, but you also sing in the film.
I do.
Let's talk about that. What is it that you sing in the film?
I sing a song called Burafera, and I think, well, I know, actually, that there is no more significant song for Yorta people, for my extended family, for those of us who come from Cumragunja Mission Station, that Burafera for a time was one of the only tangible pieces of our culture that we had. You know, I spoke earlier on about the fact that language and song were outlawed, they were illegal, that indeed if you were caught speaking your language, if you were caught engaging in tradition and custom, you were punished. You were punished by having your rations taken, or, as Alec has talked about in Lousy Little Sixpence so extraordinarily, quite often you were punished by having your children forcibly removed from you. So the stakes were incredibly high. But the ingenuity of elders, and particularly of the Briggs family, and Auntie Lois Peeler, who's the custodian for Burafera now, from their family, and her older sister Hillis Morrison, and Auntie Geraldine Briggs before them, who had kept this story alive, they had this ingenuity. They went to the church and said, all right, well, if we translate your hymns into our language, more people might come. And as long as it was there for the grace and glory of their God, they were willing to acquiesce to this. And so they hid language in the church. They hid those stories away. People like Auntie Faye Carter, who does appear in the film, talks about going and hiding in the bush and not being able to use the possum skin cloaks to make drums anymore, but they would use the pillows from their beds to beat, to carry on ceremony out in the forest. Burafera is this. It's a tangible piece of our language, and whilst we might not necessarily agree with the Christian sentiment of it, perhaps well, not all of us, it still stands that test of time, and it's an extraordinary song. I mean, it's about Moses and the Israelites making their way out of bondage, escaping Pharaoh, and escaping across the sea. I mean, it's all of these stories which have such resonance for Yura people as well. We're river people. We escaped across that river into Victoria. So we went on our own. All right, it did go for 40 years, though. It wasn't quite as far. But all of these, there are so many parallels and so much history that it seemed there was no better song to take back to the Pilbara. That song of ingenuity and hope that had kept our language alive and it still feeds us now has become something of an anthem for us. And I'm incredibly grateful to Auntie Lois and the Briggs family for their permission to use the song and the support that they've given us and the fortitude that they had in keeping it alive.
Would you sing some of it now?
Wamriga Moses Ninian Wala Yapune Puch Ngara Bora Fera Yomanayala Ngara Bora Fera Yomanayala Yala Ngara Bora Fera Yomanayala Yala Ngara Bora Fera Yomana Bora Fera Yomana Bora Fera Yomana Yala Yala.
Thank you so much for sharing this. This is, I'm deeply moved. So, this is a question for both of you. What are your hopes for with Ablaze? What are you expecting or hoping to hear from an audience?
Do you want us to
you
answer
go first.
at the same time? As many audience as possible to see it. I think the main thing is for me is like any of these films, is as many people as possible get to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes somewhat without saying for me that I just want people to see it. I hope people feel that they'll see it and they'll want to tell that story to other people.
Any hopes you would like to share for the future?
The knowledge that I wouldn't even be here, nor would I be aware of that trauma were it not for the strength of others. And I don't have it in my power to see to it that this intergenerational trauma stops with me. Because there will be aspects of it that my kids have to engage with. But what I can give them is I can give them the knowledge of that strength. And what I can do is I can take my strength from that every day. And in that way, I suppose in many ways I'm grateful for it as well, because it does keep me focused. It reminds me who I am, and it reminds me, I think most importantly, of who I want to be. And that strength is something I'll forever be grateful for.
I can just say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for this absolutely beautiful time spent together, for opening up and sharing this with us. And I'm looking forward to seeing Ablaze in the cinemas, hopefully also here.
Hopefully over there, yes.
Well,
yes.
if we get if we get an indication of when it's going to be over there, we will let you know.
In Berlin.
That's right. And otherwise, see you somewhere else, wherever. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening to our podcast, Invisible Wound. Our next 2 episodes will be dedicated to an incredible woman named Larissa Behrendt. She will tell us about her empowering, strength-based approach in her work